The wind howled like a beast, clawing at the walls of the cabin with a ferocity that matched the hunger of the mountains themselves. Clara pulled her worn gloves tighter as she hammered the last spike into the broken fence. The wind was relentless, as if trying to tear the land from her fingers, but she fought back, one strike at a time. Her hands were raw, the skin cracked and bleeding, yet she hardly noticed. Winter had a way of stealing a person's attention. It stole your warmth, your strength, and left you with only what you could endure. Clara stood there a moment, breath steaming in the frigid air. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, her worn shirt clinging to her back, soaked with sweat. She was 32, but the grief and the cold had carved deep lines into her face, making her feel like she'd lived a lifetime longer. Since Amos died, it had been nothing but this endless struggle. Another gust of wind tore at the fence rail, and Clara's fingers slipped, the hammer flying from her grasp. It landed in the snow with a dull thud, and she cursed under her breath, the words lost to the wind. It was no use. She was alone now. Alone, and she had only herself to rely on. The sound of frantic squawking cut through the wind, jarring Clara out of her thoughts. She turned, heart racing. It was the chickens, her last living creatures. "No," she muttered, her voice a whisper against the howling wind. She dropped the hammer and ran, her boots sinking deep into the snow as she struggled toward the lean-to where the chickens were kept. One of them had already fallen victim to a hungry predator. A gray shape darted out from behind the coop, a coyote, gaunt and starving, its ribs visible through its matted fur. It had the second chicken in its jaws, and it froze as Clara appeared. The coyote's eyes met hers, and for a moment there was a flicker of hesitation. Then it tried to scramble away, but its legs sank deep into the snow. Clara didn't hesitate. She ran for the shotgun propped against the cabin wall. Her hands were numb as she grabbed it, the metal burning cold through her gloves. The coyote didn't move fast enough. She aimed. The blast was deafening. The coyote fell. A cloud of smoke hung in the air as Clara walked to the dead animal, kicking it aside with her boot. The second chicken flapped nervously nearby, but Clara ignored it. The cabin was small and dark. She plucked the bird, its warm body still twitching in her hands. Inside, the fire crackled, sending up a gust of warmth as she set the chicken to roast. Then there came the knock. It wasn't a knock. It was a heavy, desperate pounding that rattled the door in its frame. Clara froze. The only person who ever came uninvited was Amos, stumbling home drunk and violent from town. Her fingers tightened around the shotgun, which lay next to her, and she stood in silence, listening. Another knock came, followed by a low, rasping voice. "Shelter!" Clara's pulse quickened. She moved toward the small window, wiping away the frost. There, in the fading light, stood a man, huge, draped in furs that had iced over in the bitter wind. His face was a tangled mess of beard and hair, his clothes stiff with snow. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, and Clara saw the dark stain spreading from his left shoulder, dripping down his side. He looked like he'd been chewed up by the mountains themselves. "Go away," Clara called, her voice flat, hard. He didn't move, his gaze, pale and desperate, fixed on her. Then he spoke, his voice strained. "I'll trade," he said. "Just one night. The floor. I'll trade." Clara stood there, shotgun in hand, unsure if it was fear or the sting of something else that made her hesitate. She hadn't had company in over a year, not since Amos, not since she buried him in the frozen earth. The thought of letting another man in felt like an unbearable weight, but the man was swaying, on the edge of collapse. "No," she said again, raising the shotgun so he could see it through the glass. The man's eyes flickered toward the door, and he fumbled with the pack on his back. It hit the snow with a muffled thud. He tugged at the straps, pulling out a bundle of pelts. 10, he rasped, throwing the skins toward the door. "Prime beaver, 10 pelts. For the floor. For one night." Clara stared at the pile of furs. 10, enough to buy food for the next year, enough to pay the taxes Amos had left her with. The offer was absurd. She looked back at the man. He wasn't standing, not anymore. His breath was ragged, his body trembling from more than just the cold. He was dying. The silence in the room stretched between them, heavy and thick with unspoken words. "Just the floor," she said finally, her voice sharp. "If you try anything, I'll shoot you where you stand." The man nodded. He didn't say another word as he stumbled past her into the cabin, bringing the bitter chill of the mountain air with him. His massive form filled the room, and the smell of blood and frozen wilderness followed him inside. He collapsed onto the floor near the hearth, curling toward the warmth without so much as a glance in her direction. Clara shut the door, her heart thudding in her chest. She didn't know what to think, didn't know what to feel. The fire was crackling, sending dancing shadows across the room. She ate her chicken standing, the shotgun within arm's reach. The man didn't move. She tried to tell herself he wasn't a threat. He was weak, close to death. But something twisted in her chest, a warning. When it was time to sleep, she laid a thin quilt on the floor at a safe distance from him. "That's yours," she said, her voice cutting the stillness. He stirred, his pale eyes meeting hers for a moment. Then, without a word, he crawled onto the quilt with a deep groan. Clara lay on her cot, shotgun at her side, staring at the ceiling. She didn't sleep. Instead, she listened to the man's labored breathing, the sound of the wind outside, the crackle of the fire. The storm outside raged on, and with it, something else stirred inside her, something familiar, something long buried. And yet, she couldn't make herself look away. The fire crackled softly in the corner, its glow casting flickering shadows across the small cabin. Clara stayed by the hearth, her hands busy with the pot of chicken broth she had been making, the smell of it filling the air. She kept her eyes on the stranger, who had not moved since he collapsed onto the floor by the fire. His breath was shallow, labored, and his pale, unshaven face was drawn with pain. He hadn't said a word since entering the cabin, just settled into the warmth, his back arched in exhaustion. Clara didn't know why she hadn't kicked him out, why she hadn't taken the 10 pelts and sent him stumbling back into the storm. But something held her back. Some stubborn, unshakable part of her refused to let him die out there. The man's name was Elias, he had said, though he hadn't offered much else in the way of details. He hadn't asked for anything, not even food. But Clara knew that would come soon enough. There were things that had to be said, things that had to be done. She stared at him for a long moment. His ragged breath made the silence between them thick, heavier than the snow that still pounded against the walls. She could see the way his body trembled, the fever burning behind his gray eyes, the same cold emptiness that had taken root inside her when Amos died. But she couldn't afford to feel sorry for him. He was just another stranger, just another man, with his own set of troubles, just like Amos. She had no room for that kind of weakness. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the cabin's thin walls. Clara set the broth down and walked over to him, her footsteps muffled by the snow-covered floor. Her hand tightened around the shotgun, her finger brushing the trigger as she bent over him. She had no idea what she planned to do if he woke up, if he moved. But she could feel the uncertainty gnawing at her, and she hated it. "Hey," she called softly, her voice rough from the cold but steady. "You're awake." Elias stirred, his breath hitching in a shallow gasp. His pale eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first and then locked onto her face. There was a moment's hesitation before he spoke. "Who?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "Where?" "Clara," she said flatly, her hand still resting on the shotgun. "This is my cabin. I gave you a place to sleep for the night, like we agreed." He nodded, his face still pale with pain, but the faintest glimmer of understanding passed through his foggy eyes. He made an effort to sit up, but he collapsed back onto the floor with a strangled groan. "You're not getting up," Clara said, her tone cold. She didn't soften it. She had no room for softness. Elias didn't answer, but he swallowed hard, as though the words themselves were too much for him. He closed his eyes again, his breathing shallow and erratic. Clara stared at him for a moment before looking away. She couldn't bear to look at him any longer. This broken stranger, who had no place in her life, who had no right to be here. She turned back toward the fire, feeling the heat from the flames licking at her skin, but it did nothing to quell the cold inside her. She worked in silence, stirring the broth, her movements slow, deliberate. The silence between them was thick, but it wasn't the quiet of comfort. It was the kind of silence that filled the room with uncertainty, a stillness that pressed in on her, suffocating and unwelcome. Elias didn't speak for a long time, but when he finally did, his voice was low, strained, as if speaking took too much effort. "Thank you," he rasped. Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. She didn't know what to say to him, this man who had nothing to offer but his brokenness. "Do you need food?" she asked after a moment, her voice flat. Elias shook his head slowly, his face pale with fever and exhaustion. He didn't have the strength to argue. "I've eaten," he said softly, though Clara didn't believe him. The hunger was still there, visible in the way his body trembled. It was the kind of hunger that came from more than just a lack of food. It was the kind that came from surviving, from losing everything and still having to fight. Clara set the pot of broth down on the small table by the hearth and took a seat across from him. She folded her arms across her chest, her gaze never leaving his face. "You'll need to stay until the storm clears," she said, her voice sharp. "If you can't move, I'll have to help you. You won't last out there." Elias didn't respond right away. His eyes closed briefly, as though he were trying to summon the strength to say something, anything. When he finally spoke, his words were slow, labored. "I'm not asking for your help," he said, his voice a low rasp. "I just need a night." Clara leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't sure why she was even still talking to him. Why hadn't she kicked him out? But something inside her kept her still. She wanted to yell at him, to tell him to leave, but she didn't. He had 10 pelts. 10 pelts for one night. And, in a way, that was enough. It was more than enough. But something else lingered between them. Something unspoken. Something she didn't want to face. "Just one night," she said flatly, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "Then you leave." Elias nodded slowly, his gray eyes darkening with a flicker of gratitude. Or was it resignation? She couldn't tell. The night settled over the cabin like a heavy blanket, and they both sat in the silence, the fire crackling between them. Clara couldn't bring herself to look at him. She couldn't even tell if he was still awake, though she could feel his presence in the room like a weight. She lay down on her narrow cot, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders, but sleep wouldn't come. Not yet. The storm raged on outside, but Clara's thoughts drifted far beyond the snow, beyond the man lying by the hearth. They drifted to Amos, to the land, to the life that was slipping through her fingers. She squeezed her eyes shut, and for just a moment, she allowed herself to forget, to feel something that wasn't pain or fear. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. And for a fleeting moment, Clara felt a strange, aching warmth in the quiet of the cabin. The storm raged outside, the wind screeching like an angry beast as it slammed against the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled softly, filling the room with warmth and light. But the silence between Clara and Elias was thick, almost tangible, stretching out across the cabin like a veil that neither of them could break. Clara lay awake, her back to the wall, staring up at the ceiling, her mind whirling. The events of the day felt like they had happened weeks ago, but the weight of them was still fresh in her chest. The man lying by the hearth was nothing like the men she had known. He wasn't like Amos. He wasn't like the traders or the strangers who had passed through this lonely part of the country. Elias was something else, something darker, and yet, in some way, something more familiar. Clara shut her eyes tight, willing herself to sleep, but the memory of his gray eyes lingered. They had been full of something. Grief, pain, a quiet strength that didn't quite belong here. But it was there, in the way he held himself, in the way he had moved through the cabin, and it unsettled her in a way she didn't want to admit. The storm howled outside, but it was Elias's breathing that filled the cabin. It was slow, steady, and broken in places, the sharp rasp of it a reminder that he was still here, still alive, still a part of this fragile, fleeting world. Clara turned her head and glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He lay still, his broad frame draped in the heavy furs he had traded for his place by her fire. His face was relaxed, but there was no mistaking the shadows beneath his eyes, the tightness in his jaw. She didn't know what had brought him to this point, but she could feel the heaviness of it, the burden that hung over him. The warmth of the fire spread through the cabin, but Clara could still feel the coldness in her bones. She longed to sleep, but something kept her awake, kept her rooted in this strange moment between the two of them. It was more than the storm, more than the man on the floor. It was the weight of the choices she had made, the things she had survived. After a long time, she couldn't stay still any longer. She rolled over on her cot, her blanket rustling as she sat up. Her eyes lingered on Elias for a moment before she slowly stood and made her way to the small stove in the corner of the room. She worked in silence, her movements slow and deliberate as she checked the fire, ensuring the embers were still hot enough to keep the cabin warm through the night. The smell of the smoke was thick in the air, but it felt comforting. She didn't mind it. The fire had always been her anchor, the one thing she could rely on. As she worked, she heard a faint groan from the hearth. Elias shifted, his body twitching slightly, as he murmured something low in his sleep. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to speak. Not after all this time. Not after everything that had happened. "Please," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper, thick with fever. "Let him go. Please." Clara's heart twisted in her chest. She wanted to look away, to ignore the pain that bled through his words, but she couldn't. She stood there, motionless, watching him, the storm outside forgotten for a moment. He muttered again, his voice growing more frantic, the words slurring together in a string of disjointed sentences. "No, not again. Please don't let him." Clara's hands clenched at her sides, her chest tight with something that wasn't quite sympathy, wasn't quite pity. It was the same feeling she had had when she had seen him collapse in the doorway. This strange, unsettling recognition of something dark and deep in him. She took a step closer to him, her heart pounding in her chest. He didn't notice. He didn't even stir as she moved to his side. His hand twitched, his fingers curling as though reaching for something. Clara knelt beside him, her knees creaking on the cold floor. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to help him. She could have woken him, shaken him from whatever nightmare he was trapped in, but something held her back. She was afraid of what might happen if she did. The wind outside screamed louder, the sound of it drowning out everything else. But in the silence of the cabin, Clara could hear the soft rasp of Elias's breath, the agony of his words, and the way he seemed to be fighting against something he couldn't escape. Finally, after what felt like hours, Elias's breathing steadied, and he fell into a deeper, more peaceful sleep. Clara stayed by his side, her heart still racing, but a quiet resolve beginning to settle over her. She wasn't sure why she hadn't thrown him out, why she hadn't taken the pelts and sent him back into the storm. But now, as the storm raged outside, she couldn't help but wonder if she had made the right choice. The storm would pass. It always did. And when it did, she would be left with whatever decision she had made. As she returned to her cot, her thoughts began to clear, the haze of her own exhaustion starting to take over. She pulled the blanket tightly around her, trying to push the fear and confusion from her mind. But just before sleep claimed her, one last thought lingered in her head. What was he running from? The days stretched out, one blending into the next, like the endless snow that piled higher against the cabin walls. The storm had passed, but it had left a lingering chill that wasn't just in the air. There was something else, something between Clara and Elias, that neither of them could ignore. Elias had stayed, just as he promised, though he had hardly spoken since that first night. He kept to himself, his presence quiet but undeniable. He worked when he could, chopping wood, repairing the fence, mending the roof that had begun to sag under the weight of the snow. His shoulder, though still wounded, had begun to heal, but it wasn't just his body that was slowly recovering. It was his soul, too, though Clara didn't know how long that might take. She watched him from the window on the days when he worked outside, his movements slow but determined. There was something about the way he carried himself now, something that made him seem less like the broken stranger she had taken in, and more like a man who had earned his place in this world. Still, the air between them was thick with unspoken words, with things neither of them was ready to confront. Clara, too, had changed in these days. Her hands had grown stronger, calloused from work. The fear that had once clung to her like a shadow had begun to fade, replaced by something harder, something that matched the steel she felt inside her bones. She had not just survived her husband's death, she had built herself up from the ashes of that life. And yet, as much as she worked, as much as she fought to keep the land intact, there was still something missing. She would never admit it aloud, not to Elias or anyone else, but the loneliness had become a weight she couldn't shake. It was a hollow ache that throbbed in her chest, reminding her of everything she had lost, everything she had fought for, and everything she had never had. The cabin was no longer just a home, it was a fortress. But the silence between her and Elias was the quietest kind of war. One afternoon, just as the sun began to dip low behind the mountains, Clara heard a sound at the door. A faint knock, sharp and insistent. She froze. No one came this far out into the high country, not in the dead of winter, especially not without warning. She grabbed the shotgun, her heart pounding as she crossed the room. The air seemed to still, the world outside waiting with her. She peered through the crack in the door, her breath catching when she saw the man standing there. It was Abner Potts, her neighbor from 12 miles east. He had a broad, weathered face, and his broad shoulders were hunched against the cold. But his eyes were warm as he looked up at her. "Clara," he said, his voice low but filled with concern. "I've got a letter for you." Came from the marshal himself. "You'd best take a look." Clara opened the door just enough to take the letter from him, her fingers trembling as she held it. She didn't know what it was, but the look on Abner's face told her it wasn't good. "You all right?" he asked, his eyes flicking past her into the cabin. Clara nodded, forcing herself to smile. "Just fine, Abner. Just the cold gets to me sometimes." Abner nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. "You keep your head down, Clara. You got that stubborn streak in you, but it won't do you any good with these men around." Clara's gaze dropped to the letter in her hand. "I know," she murmured, her voice low. "I'll be fine." He hesitated, his eyes softening with concern. "If you need anything, you know where to find me." Clara didn't answer him right away. She could feel Elias watching her from the shadows, his gray eyes sharp and calculating. The two men had met briefly when Abner had come to check on the fence line a few days ago, but Clara had kept the details of their arrangement to herself. Abner gave her a quick nod before turning and walking back down the porch, disappearing into the snow. Clara shut the door behind him and turned to Elias, who was still sitting by the fire, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Clara didn't answer right away. She didn't want to show him the letter, not yet. Not when she didn't know what it meant. The words on the page felt heavy, but she knew she couldn't keep running from whatever was coming. She walked to the small table by the hearth, unfolding the letter with shaking hands. The letter was short, but it packed a punch. "Dear Mrs. Barrow, I am writing to inform you that the claims against your property have been reviewed. The original notice of abandonment, filed by Mr. Silus Croft, has been deemed invalid by the territorial court. However, you are required to appear in person at the Three Forks Land Office within 30 days to prove continued occupancy and to resolve the outstanding tax claims. Failure to do so will result in further action. Sincerely, Territorial Marshal H. Sanders." Clara let the letter fall to the table, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breath. She didn't need to look at Elias to know he was already on his feet, moving toward her, his gaze sharp with worry. 30 days, she whispered, her voice thick. "They won't stop until they get what they want. Croft will come for me." Elias stepped forward, his presence filling the small cabin. His eyes met hers, cold but determined. "We won't let him take it from you." Clara shook her head, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. "How? How can we fight him? He has the law. He has the bank. I have nothing but this land." "You've got more than that," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "You've got the fight in you. I've seen it." Clara looked at him, her heart aching. She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. She had survived so much. She had fought for this place, fought for this life, and she wasn't going to let Croft or anyone else take it from her now. "I can't do it alone," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I don't know how." "You don't have to," Elias replied, his voice firm. "I'm not going anywhere, not now, not ever." Clara's breath hitched in her chest. She could see it in his eyes. The same promise, the same silent vow that he had made when he first stepped into her cabin. He would stay. He would fight for her, for them. And in that moment, Clara knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together.